pathways. Welcome up, Guy. You need a clicker? Yes, we'll get that to you right away.
Unlike Julie, I need a script, so I'm going to wait to get the clicker and then I can get my script. So just as a way of introduction, I'm going to talk about from a rather different way about the issues around psychedelics. And that's how we get them legalized. And the route that I'm going to talk about is the route through regulation. And that, I thought, is probably the most reliable way that we can be confident of getting these drugs into the hands of clinicians so that we can really learn how to use them. But on the way there, we're going to have a lot of hassle. And I'm going to describe some of the hassle. So before I start, disclosures. I work for Compass Pathways, much as I was an academic for most of my life. I rather failed retirement, and so I came back to work for Compass Pathways in 2021. And I previously consulted with other companies in this space. I also now work with lawyers, and they have a great love of this sort of literature, we call it that. And you'll be tested on the content later, but essentially what I'm going to say is that I will be making forward-looking statements, and that means that I'll be making statements that if you want to rely on them, you've got to check them against the risks that they don't come true, and we submit those risks to the Security and Exchange Commission in New York, and you can read them there. So that's that. Okay, now, you've heard a little bit about MDMA, and the great hope was that MDMA in 2024 would be recognized as a medicine by the FDA, and that would be rescheduled and it would be available for the sort of treatments that Julie was talking about. Unfortunately, this letter arrived at Paul Berra's inbox from the FDA. It's a complete response letter, which basically, as I'm sure you're all aware, turned down the filing that it made in the previous year. So the issue for me is, my job essentially is to avoid getting this letter. And so we can learn a little bit from the MDMA experience, and we can also see how we try to do things differently at Compass. With, of course, unfortunately, the first mover always gets the worst shit. We can learn from the MDMA experience, and we've profited from that to some extent. So the issues for Lykos, and I think there's been a lot of talk and a lot of paranoia about why it was turned down. The actual reasons we now really know, because the administration released a whole pile of CRLs, pardon me. And the issues for Lykos are, first of all, for the FDA, is the selective collection of adverse events. That was one of the issues that came up for the FDA. Forget about the AdCom. That's something a bit different. The second was the absence of durability, of evidence for durability beyond 8 weeks. And they really didn't have data that was really adequate for that. And then finally, high prior use of MDMA, which of course was unblinding. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it kind of was a problem for both the AdCom and, as you can see, for the FDA. And what their recommendation is, and what Lykos, I believe, are trying to do, is to do a further study, which won't be against inert placebo. We're going to touch on that. It'll be against a low-dose comparator. So those are the actual issues formally about why there was refusal of that application. The objectives for Compass Pathways is to complete a phase 3 program and to get regulatory approval for treatment-resistant depression. You have to be very narrow. It's a weakness of the system, but that's the way it works. So you have to have a defined target population. You have to do clinical trials to demonstrate the benefits, the efficacy of the drugs, and the risks, the adverse events. And you've got to put those together so that people who prescribe them and people who take them can understand the risk-benefit balance. And finally, the reason you want to see this go through regulation is that it then means you can get reimbursement and hopefully equitable access to these drugs, which otherwise, if it goes through other routes, is by no means guaranteed. So what we have to submit to the FDA is a comprehensive NCE, a new clinical entity package, because technically, you laugh at this, psilocybin is a new, as far as the FDA are concerned, psilocybin is a new chemical entity. And that's because it's never actually been submitted to the FDA before. So that is actually an advantage for us. It means that it's possible to do these studies with some patent protection. Now, the first is there has to be a non-clinical development program. So there has to be a whole pile of stuff about the chemistry, about the formulation, about the way the drug is cleared in the body. That includes a clinical pharmacology package. All of this is very slow. It takes a lot of people to do a lot of really tedious experiments, and you can put together a lot of data. And then finally, the stuff we all sort of know about, which is clinical efficacy and safety. And so we had a phase 2b trial in TRD, and that study completed and was a very large study by the standards of phase 2 studies, over 200 patients. We then had an open label trial to look at co-administration, big issue you've already heard. A long-term follow-up study, which wasn't very big, but at least it tried. And then 2 big phase 3 trials that are ongoing. And it just so happens that a few weeks ago, we read out a very brief top-line summary of the first of those studies, which was strongly statistically positive. So we're 2 for 2. We have a third study, which we will know the results of next year. And that means we're well on the way to fulfilling, we think, the necessary criteria for approval. Now, if you look at this graphic here, what you can see is what it takes to do phase 3 program in this area. So there are 2 trials, which we're calling very imaginatively 005 and 006. And 005 is a comparison between COMP360 psilocybin, 25 milligrams, against inert placebo. And the reason we're doing that is because the FDA want an inert placebo arm. It's pretty difficult to interpret efficacy-wise, but safety-wise, it's useful. These patients will go for 6 weeks. We then have a readout of the primary outcome at that point, and then we go blinded for another 20 weeks. So we're getting real follow-up data here for both safety and efficacy, and there's some options for retreatment. And then finally, patients get into Part C, and all of them are eligible for retreatment with an open label dose of 25 milligrams. So there is a reward for patient behavior in this study. In 006, Part A is 2 administrations of one of 3 different doses, 25, 10, or 1. This is a design we used in phase 2. The readout again at 6 weeks, and then options for retreatment, and you can, as you can see, then through to the Part C where everyone is eligible for open label. And just take a look at the numbers required. The numbers required here. In this study, we're looking for over 255 patients. And in the second study, over 568 patients. So we're getting to the scale where we will, in our combined, when we submit this dossier, we'll have over 1,000 patients randomized. And that will give a lot of data to understand what we're doing. And as you can see, it will give a real sense of the effectiveness and the safety of these drugs. So what do we face in the academic community? Well, we basically face concerns about placebo. And the first is the belief that any benefit from a psychedelic could be a placebo response to unblinding. So you know you've got the drug, and somehow that predisposes you to fill out forms in a different way, right? So that's the first suspicion. The second is that any lesser response you see in the control arm is just nocebo, like you're so disappointed that you're going to rate yourself as miserable. And then finally, there's a certain sense that this isn't about drugs, it's about psychotherapy. So if you put those 3 things together, the result is confusion. And it's our job really to try and clarify, my job anyway, to clarify this and to try and make the job for the FDA much easier so that they don't hear these messages buzzing in their ears as they look at our 1,000-patient data. So the questions I want to talk about today is first of all, does therapy bias outcomes, and is what we're doing therapy? Now, you're going to get into controversy right away, but that's what I'm going to go for. The second is the placebo response all about expectations, and does unblinding really drive psychedelic experience? We have a little bit of data on that. And then finally, what actually does drive the clinical response that we see? Because that essentially is the question. When you look at a response, you say, well, it might be placebo, it might be this. It's really how much is placebo and how much is a mechanism we can understand which can be attributed to the drug. Because the FDA regulates medicines and drugs, does not regulate psychotherapy, doesn't regulate clinical practice. It wants to know that you're giving a pharmacology to a drug that can then be approved for treatment in man. So let's look about therapy. I mean, can bias be introduced by psychotherapy? I mean, I think it's obvious it can. I worked in a department that was famous for psychotherapy research, and people tore themselves in knots trying to design fair comparisons of one psychotherapy with another. And the reasons are pretty obvious, that if you have allegiance bias, then you can influence the way the treatments are delivered, you can influence the way the patients are assessed at the end of treatment, it can affect in all sorts of conscious and unconscious ways how the whole output of the data is framed, and if you combine that with a bit of p-hacking, then we know that there can be bias in psychotherapy trials. So the issue, I think, is important, is whether or not it's psychotherapy. And bear in mind that the Lycos studies, MAP studies, always said, and I think quite rightly, that they were doing psychotherapy that was assisted by MDMA, that the content of what was going on in the sessions with the drug was psychotherapy, and it was influenced by the drug. And so that was a different kind of problem, I think, from the one that we have with the classic psychedelic experience, because it's actually immersive, and rather than interacting with the therapist, we have to teach therapists to not disturb the patient's inward journey, if you like. So essentially, distraction would reduce the probability that you get an immersive experience. The second is that we think we know, that you nevertheless, because of the nature of the experience and the vulnerability of patients during it, that you have to have preparation, you have to have support, you have to have follow-up. Some people would argue you have to have integration. Some would think you're integrating for the rest of your life. But you certainly have to have some kind of follow-up, and you have to have some idea of what happened to the patient, good and bad. And then finally, for a trial, if you're going to provide preparation, support, and follow-up, because of the psychotherapy echoes that I think are still in our protocols without it being psychotherapy, you've got to show that the therapists behave consistently. And so for that reason, what we do is to record all the sessions, and in a sample we have transcribed them, sent them to a third party for the assessment of the extent to which we can say there is fidelity to the behaviors that we teach people, that is the therapists, in our training program. And that training program we published and tries to specify all the elements that we think are key to preparation. You can read them here. The elements that are part of administration and the elements that are part of integration. And what we can do is, what this company, Empathic, are doing, is to go through those individual scripts and rate them for whether or not we're getting the sort of fidelity that we would want. And what we're looking for is over 80%. And that is very good. If you audit psychotherapy transcripts in the same way, you're lucky to get to 65%. So we think we can deliver a very standard support to patients, and so we can say, hand on heart to the FDA, this is a support that allows you to interpret the effects of a drug. It isn't about psychotherapy. Now, we've gone a bit further than this, and we wanted to just look in real detail about what happens during the actual experience. And so what we've done is look at speech output in different phases of the treatment support. So we've gone madly quantitative on this and measured the sort of silences, and we've measured the amount of speech from the therapist and from the patient in different phases. And this graph shows you on the left, V2 is the preparation, the last preparation visit. V3 is the actual administration visit, so that's 8 hours worth, and you can see it drops down dramatically for both patient and for therapist. The participant is in green and the therapist is in blue. And then in the follow-up visits, you can see there were 3 follow-up visits in this study, 18 patients for PTSD treated open label with 25 milligrams. So this is a 25 milligram experience. You can see that what happens is that basically the participant does all the talking when you go into the follow-up sessions. Now, what happens in V3, this isn't published yet, I hope it will be, is that about nearly 80% of the time during a 25 milligram cycle, and this won't surprise any of you, I'm sure, but it's very nice to prove it because people remember it when you show them this sort of data, is that 80% of the time there's silence. And the time when people are speaking is either at the beginning, when, depending on exactly when the recording starts, there's a little bit of toing and froing and getting ready, and then at the end as people obviously at different times prepare to leave and start planning their exit, so to speak. So this is, I think, really good quantitative data that when we talk about what our therapists do, we really know. So is the placebo response all about expectation, and does unblinding explain everything? Well, this is a typical placebo-controlled study of an oral antidepressant. And these are nightmare studies because there are huge placebo responses in most of these studies. Now, when we say a placebo response, we usually think that it's something about the pill and the expectation around the pill being a medicine, because we're pill-taking species, very much so. So you do have that, but you have to remember that there is certainly something else, which is the setting, the therapeutic alliance between the doctor usually and the patient, and other stuff, the number of visits, the amount of attention, the length of the visits, all sorts of things play into the placebo response. It isn't just the expectation about the pill, and we never really know how much it's half of this and half of that. Indeed, there's sort of some evidence, anecdotally, that the sort of sites you want delivering the sort of this kind of care in a clinical trial should be really unpleasant places to visit. Whereas usually they're really nice and everyone's delightful and you get cups of tea and attention. And that's non-specific and that contributes to the placebo response. So anyway, so how do we line this up in a depression trial where we know there's going to be a placebo response? What should be our expectations in psychedelics? Well, a single pill, really? The single pill is going to be a placebo for the next 6 weeks? Clearly we shouldn't expect a big pill placebo response. So we have to assume there's also unblinding, so that's going to go against the pill placebo. The pill is going to be unblinded in an inert study. That's not going to have very high expectations. And then, as you can see, expectation may be further reduced, expectation of drug response may be magnified. So these fears, I think, are well placed when you have an inert placebo in a trial. And therapeutic alliance may contribute to all arms, so you might be able to do a study that shows a placebo response, but it might equally be the case that you see none at all. So what actually happens, this is an example of the GH research trial, 5-methoxy-DMT inhalation. Thank you to Josh for this slide and data. Up to 3 ascending doses in the active arm, 3 times placebo in the control arm. So this is the most unblinding you could possibly be, okay? You don't just get 1 chance to pick placebo, you get 3. And then you have a very active arm, which increases the dose if you don't have the full effect. So what do you expect to see? Well, you basically see no placebo response at all. So from a depression trial with a massive placebo response, difficult to distinguish from the active, you go the other way. You've got a huge difference. And this is the kind of problem that if you're a real skeptic, you say, well, game, set, and match. No placebo response, we understand that. Big treatment response, that's all unblinding. So, you know, there is a problem if all of your data is based on this comparison. No setting, no expectation, no placebo. Now, is that a true drug effect, or is there a big placebo effect in there? That is the question, and we will come on to that in a moment, and when we think about what actually drives the treatment response. Now, it is possible to do studies with psilocybin, in this case, where there's a very clear response in the comparison arm, and this is the Imperial study comparing 25 milligrams of escitalopram against 25 milligrams of psilocybin against escitalopram, and there were 2 administrations of psilocybin, and there were matching in the escitalopram arm. There were 2 1 milligram sessions, and you can see here that there's a really comparable, quite large effect of giving 1 milligram psilocybin alongside escitalopram. So it's not like you never see or can't see a big effect in a control arm with these drugs. So this is kind of the proof of that. And this is also a great study in that they actually measured expectation in this study. So they asked patients what they expected of psilocybin, what they expected of escitalopram in advance of the actual randomization. And so they were able to show, as you might expect, that psilocybin had higher expectations. But, you know, this is the depressed group. Depressed patients, really characteristically, are not looking on the bright side. And so even then, they're coming into this study, and you can see their expectancy of results is still not skewed completely to the high end. It's just a bit greater for psilocybin. And what was really interesting is that when you look at whether that baseline expectancy predicted the fall in the Hamilton, what you can probably see is that in the case of escitalopram, it probably did. In the case of psilocybin, it actually didn't. So that what we will be able to do in our studies is by measuring expectation, we can show whether or not expectation is driving the effect. So you could say the evidence so far is that we're not actually seeing the predicted effect of expectation, the sort of mechanism that contributes to placebo, driving the active response in an active psilocybin experiment. So the solutions to the inert placebo problem is a low-dose comparator, which is what essentially is being recommended by the FDA. That means that you have no literal unblinding to placebo. So placebo isn't the issue is the dose. And the comparison in a dose response classically is much more of a pharmacological thing than showing a difference from placebo. We can also be confident that if you have less binary expectations, then you'll be less able to discriminate between the alternatives that are presented to you, and that's sort of standard psychophysics. But of course, it'll only work if there's a dose-response relationship, and it's going to be most effective in a psychedelically naive population. And we, in fact, designed this study, which was our phase 2, to meet some of these requirements, if you like. So first of all, we randomized patients with treatment-resistant depression. We washed them off antidepressants. We insisted that no more than 10% of them had previous experience of psychedelics. And then we blindly assessed their responses over the next 12 weeks. And we showed differences between the 3 doses. But what I want to emphasize is that the experiences people had were not simply and easily discriminable as being different doses. So if you go from the left here, people had a very low experience of the more psychedelic end of the ASC, the Altered States Questionnaire. You can see that people who scored really low on that, of course, mainly received the 1 milligram, but 30% of them had received either 10 or 25. And if you go to the other extreme, of course, at the high end, most of the patients had had 25 or 10, but in the middle, it's very mixed. There's a big overlap. In green, for example, the 10 milligrams spreads across the whole range. And the 25 also spreads surprisingly towards the low end as well. And of course, the 1 milligram gives you slightly more maybe than you'd expect. So you get a lot of overlap. And I would argue it's going to be very difficult for patients to know on the basis of this experience that they've had different doses and decide what they were. So let's go to the final question of what actually does drive the clinical response in treatment-resistant depression in our data. Now, remember that I'm going to talk about the drug effect. The drug effect is an effect on the brain as well. So I'm talking about experience, but I'm also talking about an underlying change in brain connectivity. And this is illustrated in a very sort of dramatically figurative way, but nevertheless based on imaging, that when you take placebo, you don't have much interconnectivity between different modules of resting brain states. And under psilocybin, you get a lot of connectivity between different areas. So there's a big effect. You don't get this effect when you meditate, even if you're fantastically good at it. This is a real and specific effect of the classical psychedelics. And it is a brain effect, and it's always going to sit alongside your subjective effect, so bear that in mind. So what's the relationship, the fall in the MADRS and oceanic boundlessness? And what you can see here on the left is the 25 milligram group, and you can see that the intensity of the oceanic boundlessness is plotted horizontally, And the distribution is obviously to the high end, but of course it spreads across the whole range, and it's quite predictive. You know, 0.5 in the behavioral sciences is not a bad correlation coefficient. Highly statistically significant because these are big studies. Our studies are 4 or 5 times bigger than anything that's done in the academic sector. The second issue is that both 10 and 1 show the same kind of relationship, but of course you don't get as far over to the right in terms of the spread of psychedelic effect. And finally, they all go through the origin. So there's no evidence for essentially for a nocebo effect in this study. All of those things are answering important doubts and questions that lie in the heart of the skeptics' minds. Now, the other thing is, what about other parts of the experience? Do they correlate? Is it just that you can pick the intensity of the drug from the side effects, so to speak? Well, if you look at anxiety, you can see that it's dose-related, so it's higher with 25 than it is with 10 and it is with 1, but there's no association between anxiety and the outcome. These correlation coefficients are flat. So we've got specificity in our relationship. We haven't got non-specificity that you would just get from side effects. Now, correlation is not causation, but I think what we can conclude is that positive effects may activate new connections and so be neuroplastic. And, you know, the interest in what underlies this, the neurobiology of these effects, is very interesting. But secondly, as we all know, it may be deeply meaningful. So it's kind of like a life event. So you're going to have to pick your preferences. Do you want to talk about neuroplasticity, or do you want to talk about the sort of thing that Roland Griffiths was so impressed by, that, you know, people describe these effects as the most significant of their life? And of course it may be both. Why not? Negative effects, the absence of correlations, suggests that psychedelic experience is not just behavioral toxicity. And there are people like Stephen Stahl, an immensely influential psychopharmacologist, who says just this: it's behavioral toxicity, and it isn't. So I think I was going to move on. All right, okay. So let's summarize. Does therapy bias outcomes? Well, yes, it can if you don't do psychotherapy trials carefully, but I think it's an avoidable risk for these classic psychedelic experiments where essentially you're asking the therapist to step back and let the drug do the work. Is the placebo response all about expectation? No. But, you know, there is certainly evidence that expectation drives daily pill placebo. There's much less evidence that it's driving the sort of observations that we're seeing in the psychedelic literature. And what is interesting is that, you know, we don't think that unblinding drives the psychedelic response. There's really so far no evidence that it does. What does drive it is the positive psychedelic experience that we're trying to deliver for all our patients, and which the challenge for is going to be increasing the number of patients in trials who get that experience and get benefit. So with that, thank you very much to my wonderful team at Compass, site PIs in the trial, and all the participants in our studies, and for your attention today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Guy Goodwin.